Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Meines Jesum, letzte Zeit, which translates to now at length the hour is near. Fairly straightforward chorale from like a harmonic standpoint. Some of the chord progressions are a little bit quirky though, so we're going to hop right into the analysis bearing that in mind. One sharp in the key signature. We start on E minor and we end on E major, so I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is E minor. We move from E minor to another E minor chord, same chord as before, just the bass leaps up an octave, and then we get a lower suspension in the bass here with D sharp, A, F sharp, and C. Probably a 9-10 suspension underneath the alto, and this would be a 7-6, oh no, that would just be a 7-7 chord, sorry. D sharp fully diminished 7th in root position. So C would be a non-chord tone. Then we have E, G, E, and B. It's another E minor chord, root position. And then G is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark that. And then F sharp is a passing tone. We then have C, G, E, and B. Kind of an interesting chord here. This is C major 7, which would be 6-7 in the key of E minor. A little neighbor tone here. And as we're getting ready for our half cadence, we have C, F sharp, E, and A. I'm inclined to believe this F sharp is an accented non-chord tone though. This is actually A minor over C, making this a 4-6 chord. However, 2-4-3 is also, I think, a valid analysis too. It's the only reason why I think this is 4-6 rather than 2-4-3 has to do with the fact that this is not just a half cadence, it is a Phrygian half cadence, and the Phrygian half cadence is typically associated with the 4-6 chord. Usually in Bach's half cadences, or Phrygian half cadences that is, we either see a 4-6 chord or a 4-6 chord is extrapolatable from the texture. So I tend to err on the side of thinking that this is most likely a 4-6 chord rather than a 2 chord, even though 6 from a root perspective wants to go to 2. 2 and 4 are ultimately interchangeable in that regard, both in function and in pitch content. So whether you look at this as a 2-4-3 or a 6 chord, or sorry, as a 4-6 chord, I think that these are the three most likely culprits in a Phrygian half cadence situation. We usually get 6, most often some type of 6-7 chord, 4-6, and 2-4-3, and that takes us to 5, B, F sharp, D sharp, and B major root position. Next cadence is an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of G, and I do think this is a direct modulation to G. We could call G major here at the beginning 3 in the key of E minor. I think that is a valid analysis. The only reason why I'm going to call it a direct modulation is because of D natural versus D sharp. I feel like when there is a butting up against of the major dominant in a minor key and the relative major, they feel like separate ideas when a half cadence is sort of brought into the picture here. If this were an authentic cadence and then we went to G major, I think that you can make the argument, or at least a stronger argument, that it was a common chord modulation, but here I'm making the argument it is a direct modulation. But at this point, and really a lot of these sort of debatable points are usually just semantics. If you analyze the chord and the tones are there and there's an argument to be made, it's a valid analysis in my book. So G major, that's our tonic triad, G, B, G, and D. Passing tones in the inner voices. Then we have G major again, G, D, B, and D. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral there. A little neighbor tone in the alto before we get G, D, B, and E. A little variation on the chord here, very similar to a G major chord, but this would be E minor 7 over G. So we add that E to the G major chord. That makes this 6-6-5. A little neighbor tone here in the bass that looks kind of like a suspension under the, what would it be? Maybe sort of like a false suspension. Maybe like a, I don't know, a 5-6 suspension underneath the tenor. Otherwise, it just sort of looks like a suspension from the previous phrase. Even happens at the same point metrically. Wait, does it? No, it doesn't even happen up at the same. does it? No, it does happen at the same point metrically. But yeah, this isn't a real suspension, or at least, okay, a real suspension in the sense that a suspension, traditionally speaking, consists of a dissonance resolving to a consonance or two consonances. But we do see Bach sometimes use a suspended tone that doesn't resolve to a consonance. It happens every once in a while, like in this case right here. That takes us to G, C, E, and E. This is some type of C major chord. I'm going to call it 4, but maybe it's some type of 4-6-4 chord because we have G and C sort of happening at the over the course of the same beat here. But I don't know really if he is implying a C chord in second inversion here. It doesn't really look like it. It looks sort of like we have just activity here in the bass. I really don't know which bass is being implied here. But regardless, 4 is going to take us to 5, F sharp, D, D, and A, which is 5-6, D major over F sharp, passing tone in the bass, and a non-chord tone here in the alto, before we get D, D, F sharp, and D, which is just our 5 chord in root position. That would be, there is no fifth on this chord actually, it's 3 roots and a third, so that would just be 8-3, right? Because we have the octave above it and we have a third. Little passing seventh on the bass, or literally the opposite of the bass, passing seventh on the melody here, and that takes us to G major, G, D, G, and B. We also have another G major reiterated on the fourth beat of the measure. Just this is a cadential scheme that we see Bach use from time to time, where the cadence will happen on the second occurrence of the chord. Next phrase ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of E minor. So we start off with another C major chord like we saw in the previous measure, C, C, E, and G. That's 4. Little neighboring seventh here before we get C, C, E, and G again. You could make the argument this A is sort of morphing the chord into a 2-6 chord. I don't really think it's super essential, but I will put it there as a secondary analysis just in case it feels pertinent to do so, or if that's how it came up in your analysis. I think it's a valid outlook. That takes us to D sharp, B, F sharp, and B. It's actually, you know what? I'm realizing now that it makes more sense that the modulation happens here, so I'm going to get rid of that secondary analysis here just to leave room for the bracket here. And then E minor, this is going to be a 6 chord. That takes us to 5-6. So C major also being a chord in the key of E minor, it is our submediant. That takes us to 5. Or if you analyze this as A minor over C, this would be 4-6, taking us to 5-6. That would then take us presumably to 1, E, B, E, and G, with this A being an accented non-chord tone, kind of operating like a 4-3 suspension over the bass. But regardless, it's our tonic triad E minor. That takes us to A, C, E, and F sharp. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential situations. This is F sharp minor 7 flat 5 over A. That takes us to 5, B major, B, B, D sharp, and F sharp. Little delayed passing seventh here in the tenor, little anticipation here in the melody, and that takes us to our tonic E minor, E, G, B, and E. Okay, next phrase is going to take us right back to the key of G major. Lots of oscillation between the key of G major and the key of E minor in this chorale, both in terms of ideas and actual proper modulations, but we end in a perfect authentic cadence. So we start off in the key of E minor, and we don't really spend too much time in the key of E minor. We actually, in my opinion, modulate in the same point metrically that we do in the previous phrase. You might notice that actually these phrases from a melodic standpoint are very similar to one another, right? We have this idea of dotted quarter going to eighth, quarter, eighth, eighth, and we have that similar 3-beat idea going on here in the melody. They're not identical, but they're similar enough to draw a comparison, or a similar comparison between the two of them. So E minor, we don't need to reanalyze here. E, E, G, and B. passing tone in the bass, G, D, G, and B, with this C going on here as well. So I guess technically in the key of E minor this would be our 3 chord, but I think probably the modulation has already happened at this point. So I'm actually going to walk back what I said and say that the modulation happens a bit earlier in this phrase. So in the key of G major, this is our 6th chord, and in the key of G major is now our tonic. But this is a bit of a modulation zone, right? When we have 2 keys that have similar pitch content to one another, and you have a series of chords where all of the chords are shared between the 2 pitch collections, I think that there's an argument to be made that the modulation can happen anywhere in the zone, and this is an example of one of those zones where really the modulation can be happening on the E minor chord or the G major chord. To me, I feel like probably by the time we've heard G major, the modulation has occurred, especially with the context that's going to be happening after the fact. So afterwards we have G, D, A, and D. This G is probably a suspension underneath one of the voices, maybe like a 5-6 suspension, or even more likely a 9-10 suspension under the alto. But D major over F sharp, that's 5-6. That takes us right back to 1, G, D, G, and B, tonic triad. B here briefly takes our chord and puts it in first inversion. And then we have E, C, G, and C, which is C major in first inversion, 4-6. D is a passing tone, D is a passing tone, and F sharp is a neighbor tone. For all intents and purposes, there's like a passing 5-7 chord here, but I'm not going to bother marking it because it's not entirely intact. If you analyze it that way and say that there's a 5-7 chord happening in passing, I think that's totally valid as well. For me, I've really only been analyzing chords off of the harmonic rhythm if all of the tones are present, even the 5th of the chord. And that's just to be consistent with how I was analyzing earlier. But if you analyzed this as a passing 7 chord, or sorry, a passing 5-7 chord, I think that'd be totally valid as well. But after the end of this beat, we have C, E, G, and B. I think there's an argument to be made that this A is the root of this chord, and this is actually A minor over C, but I'm just going to say that this is the chord in root position with an added 7th, C major 7, but you could also analyze this as 2-6. That then takes us to D major, D, D, G, and A, very common to see 4-3 suspensions over root position dominant chords in the chorales, a little delayed passing 7th in the tenor, and then we cadence on 1, G, B, D, and G, G major, root position. Next phrase ends in an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of G. We start off with the G major chord, G, D, G, and B. Sorry, it's always hard with a line break for me to count, especially when there are skips between the notes. I have to imagine the note here. It's just a quirk about how I read. But it's another tonic triad, and even though it's the same chord reiterated, and usually I won't reiterate the Roman numeral if I see it over more than one beat, yeah, it would be, for me it makes sense to reiterate the Roman numeral when there's a line break, because it creates continuity between the two systems. So it's easier, instead of leaving a blank spot at the beginning of the new system, to just restart the new system. That's just stylistically what I do. You don't have to do that. I just want to explain why it's not continuous with what happens when I encounter the same chord over multiple beats on the same system. But afterwards we have a passing 7th in the bass, passing tone in the alto, before we get E, G, B, and B, which is E minor in root position. That's a 6th chord, passing 7th in the bass, passing tone in the tenor, before we get C, E, B, and E. Really interesting chord progression here. It's like a thirds-based chord progression, which is relatively uncommon in Bach. Usually the extent of a thirds-based chord progression will be like, actually, I looked at one and then I saw that there was another thirds-based chord progression here. I should have pointed that out earlier. Typically there's only two chords in a third space chord progression, like 6 going to 1 or 4 going to 2 occasionally. But here we see 1 going to 6 going to 4, and especially in root position, it's relatively uncommon. Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting, one of those quirky chord progressions that we see happening in passing here. Just a series of sort of passing tones that creates that effect, but all the chords are in root position, which I think is exceptionally unusual. But yeah, C, E, B, and E, some type of C major 7 chords, so that's 4-7. And then we get a chromatic bass line, a little chromatic bass line, but a chromatic bass line nonetheless. C sharp, E, A, and E. A major over C sharp, that's the dominant of D, which is our 5 chord in the key of G major. A little suspended 7th here that turns into a 4-3 suspension over our D major chord, which is our dominant. And like I mentioned just a couple minutes ago, it's very common for us to see 4-3 suspend. Actually, not even really a couple minutes ago, less than that. 4-3 suspensions are common over root position dominant triads, especially. F sharp is a chord tone. E is a little enclosure or embellishment. We then get D, D, F sharp, and A. D major, root position, the resolution to the previous beat, and then we cadence on G major. G, D, G, and B. Tonic triad, root position. Next phrase, still in the key of G major, have a half cadence at the end of it. Fairly straightforward, harmonically speaking. We start off actually probably with the most interesting thing in the phrase, is we start off with an accented non-chord tone here in the bass. F sharp, E, G, and C. A lot of 4 chords in this chorale in comparison to 2 chords, which were typically 2 chords I feel like are more common. But we get E, E, G, and C, which is C major over E, 4-6. That takes us to 5-6. F sharp, A, and D. D major over F sharp. Neighbor tones in the alto and the tenor before we get F sharp, D, A, and D again. No need to reanalyze. B is a non-chord tone. F sharp. F sharp is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And that takes us to E, E, G, and C. C major over E. That's 4-6. Passing tone in the bass. A little anticipation here in the tenor. And A is also a non-chord tone with C. That makes this D7 over F sharp, that's 5-6-5, and that takes us to G major, G, D, A, and B. Similarly to how we get 4-3 suspensions over root position dominant chords, we typically get 9-8 suspensions over root position tonic triads, so they're sort of a complement to one another. So yeah, 4-6, 5-6-1, very common subdivided chord progression in Bach, and that takes us to 5, D major, D, D, G, and A, again with another 4-3 suspension over the bass, and this F sharp being our chord tone here, and then we have another enclosure similar to what we saw in the previous phrase, but instead of ending on 1, we end on 5. D, D, F sharp, and A, so we don't need to reanalyze, it's just a resolution of the suspension. And then we have a long phrase to take out the chorale. We end in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of E minor, which I think is our overall tonic, even though we probably spend the majority of our time in G major, and there's an argument to be made that the overall tonality is G major. The fact that we start and end in E minor, I think, hierarchically takes precedence over G major being our overall key. But we stay in G major for a bit, and then or I guess for about half of the phrase, and then we go to E minor. We start off with a G major chord, the resolution to our half cadence, G, D, G, and B, passing 7th in the bass, E, E, G, and B. We've seen this rhythmic scheme in the past where this passing tone could potentially create an argument for another chord here. I'm going to say that this is a 6 chord. It could potentially be 4-6 as well if you look at C as the root of this chord rather than E. But 6 then takes us to E, B, G sharp, and D. So E minor then turning to its major counterpart, and then adding the 7th would turn this into 5-7 of 2, because E is also the dominant of A, which is our 2. D is actually a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. F sharp is a non-chord tone. That takes us to E, G sharp, and B, which is just taking our chord, putting it in root position, removing the 7th. G sharp is a chord tone. B is a chord tone, which means that the chord is briefly being put in first inversion. And that takes us to A minor. A, E, B, and C. Again, 9/8 suspensions being very common over tonic triads. A minor isn't our tonic, but it is being tonicized, so it makes sense to see the 9/8 suspension there. And then we get, I think, for me, the most interesting part of this chorale, and that is a 2-1 progression. We see our 2 chord go to our 1 chord, B, D, G, and B. So if you've watched any of my previous videos, you might have encountered me talking about how 2 going to 1 is a relatively uncommon progression. Typically speaking, when we see a 2 chord going to a 1 chord, 2 is usually in the same vicinity as a 7 chord, and the chord is typically analyzed as a 7 chord in my opinion. But in this case, we have a plain old 2 chord. It is being tonicized, and then it goes straight to G major. And when you listen to the chorale, it sounds like a 2 chord going to a 1 chord. I'd say that really the only thing that keeps this from being like maximally interesting is the fact that 2 going to 1, it's going to a 1 chord in first inversion, which sort of feels like 2 going to 3 from the bass perspective, but 2 going to 1 is a very rare progression just in plain harmonic rhythmic context here, harmonic rhythm beat to harmonic rhythm beat. So yeah, the fact that we have 2 going to 1 here is pretty cool, and definitely an exception to one of Bach's typical normal progressions. But then we get another chromatic bass line starting on the next beat. After this passing tone, we have D, D, G, and A. Again, 4/3 suspensions being very common over dominant triads, especially in root position. And I think that, you know, we have a bit of a zone here, not exactly the same type of modulation zone that we had up here, where you could analyze the modulation over G major or over E minor, but rather you could analyze this modulation after the tonicization of E minor or on D major. And I'm inclined to say that we're modulating over the D major chord, but I think really it's 6 of one, half dozen or another. If you want to analyze the modulation after the tonicization of E minor, you could, but I'm going to say that this D major chord is functioning as a predominant. We do see 7 going to 5, going to 1, with some frequency. It's not the most common chord progression, but we actually, in the most recent videos that I've been making, we've seen this with like I said, some frequency, so it's not something to write off. So regardless of whether you analyze the modulation here or here, we still go to the dominant of E minor, which is B major, D sharp, B, F sharp, and B, which is 5/6, or this would be 5/6 of 6 if you were still in the key of G major. There are definitely some chorales where I've analyzed it as a modulation after the tonicization. It really just depends on how I hear it and what my mood is, but it just goes to show that there isn't a right or wrong way of doing it. It's just a matter of perspective, and they both articulate the same thing. It really just is it's like I mentioned earlier, it's largely semantic. So after 5/6, we would expect a modulation to 1. This A is a passing 7th, E, G, E, and B. G briefly takes the chord and puts it in first inversion, so we'll change the figured bass there. That takes us to A minor over C, C, A, E, and A, 4/6. Then we have B, B, E, and G, which briefly introduces a passing 1/6/4 chord. We've seen Bach do this as sort of a buffer in between 2 similarly functioning chords. It's not uncommon for Bach to take 2 chords, typically that are a third apart, because chords that are a third apart usually have a similar function, not always, right? Like 5 and 3, for instance, or 7 and 2. They typically don't have similar functions, but, you know, 1 and 3, or 6 and 1, or 5 and 7, 4 and 2, 4 and 6, they all have similar functions. So the majority of the thirds combinations are ones that have similar functions. It's just usually whether or not the leading tone is present. But yeah, a passing 1-6-4 chord in between two similarly functioning chords, F sharp and, in this case, A minor and F sharp minor 7 flat 5 over A, C, E, and F sharp. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. We then have B, D sharp, and F sharp, which is our 5 chord in root position. A little passing 7th here in the tenor, and then we cadence like we typically do in minor chorales on a major tonic with that Picardy third here, E, G sharp, B, and E. Root position, E major triad. And that's today's analysis. Typically Bach ends minor chorales with that major chord. I think it has to do with major having a higher function as a final chord in Bach's writing, or just maybe music of the time period too, because it's not always just reserved for the last cadence. Sometimes we see it in the middle of the chorale as well, but that typically has different implications, like we're modulating back to a different key, but we don't really have that function to use as an illustration in this chorale. You'd have to go and look at another one. But other than that, really the two big takeaways are the chromatic bass lines. We have one here and we have one here, and we also have a 2-to-1 progression, which I think is really interesting because those are very rare when they're just not veiled with any type of 7 chord or, masked with any type of buffer chord in between them. There's really no sugarcoating is the wrong word there. There's really no arguing the fact that we have 2 going to 1 here. Typically there is an argument to be made if 2 going to 1 is the progression that's really underlying. But yeah, I think I'm going to cap the video off on those thoughts. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You could also hit the notification icon and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.